I'm Sarah Martinez, 32 years old, and tonight my family is about to discover that the broke artist daughter they disowned 7 years ago just sold her latest sculpture for more than my father makes in 3 years. They have no idea that the gallery opening they're attending to network with Boston's elite is showcasing my work, or that the mysterious SM whose abstract glass sculptures have been featured in Architectural Digest is me. The invitation came from my mother 3 weeks ago, delivered with her usual passive-aggressive precision. "Sarah, darling, there's a gallery opening at the Morrison Contemporary. Very exclusive. I thought perhaps you could come as my guest and see what real art looks like. Maybe it would inspire you to pursue something more practical." She had no clue that my sculpture Fractures of Light was the centerpiece of the show, or that the Morrison Contemporary had been courting me for 2 years to get an exclusive exhibition. All she knew was that her youngest daughter still lived in a converted warehouse in Somerville, still wore paint-stained clothes to family dinners, and still insisted on calling herself an artist despite having nothing to show for it. Tonight that was going to change. If you've ever been betrayed by those you loved most, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you're ready to hear how I finally stood up for myself after years of manipulation. I wasn't always the disappointment of the Martinez family. Once I was Sarah the prodigy, the little girl who could draw perfect portraits at age 7 and won every art contest in private school. My parents displayed my childhood paintings in their Beacon Hill townhouse like trophies, telling their friends about their gifted daughter who would surely become the next Georgia O'Keeffe. But somewhere between my acceptance to Harvard pre-law and my secret applications to art schools, everything shifted. My older sister Elena had already secured her place as the golden child, summa cum laude from Harvard Business School, married to a surgeon, 2 perfect children, a house in Wellesley that could grace magazine covers. My brother Miguel was following the family tradition in corporate law, making partner track at the firm where my father had built his reputation. And then there was me, the wild card who announced at my high school graduation party that I was deferring Harvard to attend the Rhode Island School of Design instead. "You're throwing away a full scholarship to Harvard for finger painting?" my father had asked, his voice carrying that particular brand of disappointment that made me feel about 2 inches tall. "It's not finger painting, Dad. It's sculpture, mixed media, installation art." "It's a hobby," my mother interrupted. "Sarah, be realistic. You can't make a living as an artist. You'll end up waiting tables and living in some horrible apartment, wondering what might have been." But I was 18 and stubborn and absolutely convinced that I could prove them wrong. I deferred Harvard for 1 year, then 2, then let the opportunity slip away entirely as I fell deeper in love with the feel of molten glass, the way light moved through my sculptures, the absolute magic of creating something beautiful from raw materials. The first few years were exactly as brutal as my parents predicted. I shared a drafty loft with 3 other artists in Providence, survived on ramen noodles and coffee, worked at a coffee shop by day and a restaurant by night to pay for studio time and materials. My sculptures were ambitious but rough, full of passion but lacking the technical skill that only comes with years of practice. My family's visits became increasingly strained. They'd walk through my cluttered studio space with forced smiles, picking their way around half-finished pieces and industrial equipment, trying to find something encouraging to say. Elena would pat my shoulder and suggest I think about getting my teaching certificate, just as a backup plan. Miguel would slip me $100 bills and tell me to call if I ever needed anything. But it was my mother's comment during my senior exhibition that finally broke something between us. Standing in front of my thesis piece, a 12-foot installation of glass and steel that had taken me 8 months to complete, she sighed and said loudly enough for my professors to hear, "Well, it's very colorful. I just hope Sarah has enough sense to get a real job before she wastes too much time on this phase." That night I called and told them I wouldn't be coming to family dinners anymore. I was tired of being treated like a child playing dress-up, tired of defending my choices, tired of feeling like a disappointment every time I walked into their house. "You're being dramatic," Elena had said when she called to smooth things over. "They love you. They just worry." "They love who they want me to be," I replied. They barely tolerate who I actually am. For 7 years, we maintained a polite distance. Holiday cards but no visits. Brief phone calls on birthdays. I knew through the family grapevine that they told people I was finding myself or going through an artistic phase. They never asked about my work, never visited my studio, never acknowledged that I had grown from a struggling student into a working professional artist. During those 7 years, everything changed. I moved to Boston, found a studio space in a converted warehouse, and began developing the technique that would become my signature, fusing glass with steel in ways that created impossible plays of light and shadow. I started selling small pieces to local collectors, then larger installations to boutique hotels and upscale restaurants. The breakthrough came 3 years ago when renowned curator James Morrison discovered my work at a group show in Cambridge. He commissioned a piece for his private collection, then another for his gallery's permanent installation. Within months, I had a waiting list of collectors and a studio assistant to help manage the workload. I started signing my pieces SM. Partly for the mystique, but mostly because I wasn't ready for my family to accidentally discover my success and come rushing back with apologies and expectations. I needed to build something solid, something undeniably real, before I faced them again. Last month, the Smithsonian acquired one of my pieces for their contemporary art collection. Next month, I'm flying to Milan for a solo exhibition at one of Europe's most prestigious galleries. But tonight, I'm walking into the Morrison Contemporary wearing my nicest black dress and my work boots, ready to watch my family's world tilt sideways. The gallery was already crowded when I arrived, the usual mix of collectors, critics, and social climbers that populated Boston's art scene. I spotted my family immediately. They had that particular look of people trying to appear culturally sophisticated while feeling completely out of their element. My mother wore her standard gallery opening uniform, black cocktail dress, pearls, and an expression of carefully cultivated interest. My father stood beside her, checking his phone and occasionally glancing at the price tags with barely concealed shock. Elena moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone accustomed to networking events, while Miguel lingered near the bar, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. None of them noticed me slip in through the crowd. I watched from across the room as they approached my largest piece in the show, Metamorphosis, a floor-to-ceiling installation of glass and copper that seemed to shift and change as viewers moved around it. "It's certainly bold," I heard my mother say to Elena. "I don't understand what it's supposed to be," my father muttered. A gallery assistant approached them with champagne and information sheets. "That piece is by SM, one of our most sought-after contemporary artists. This installation sold before the opening even began, $65,000. I watched my father's eyebrows rise. My mother leaned closer to read the placard. "SM," Elena mused. "Mysterious. No one seems to know much about the artist." "Probably some trust fund kid playing around," Miguel said, earning a sharp look from my mother. "Don't be cynical," she replied. "Whoever SM is, they're clearly talented. This piece is quite striking." I almost laughed. 7 years ago, she couldn't find a single positive thing to say about my work. Now, without knowing the artist's identity, she was ready to appreciate the exact style and technique she'd once dismissed as impractical nonsense. Memories flooded back as I watched them examine my work with newfound respect. I remembered the day I'd called my mother from my first studio in Providence, barely contained excitement in my voice as I described a commission I'd received from a local restaurant, my first real sale beyond farmers' markets and craft fairs. "A restaurant wants to buy your glass thing?" she'd asked, her tone suggesting I might be exaggerating or delusional. "It's a sculpture, Mom. A custom piece for their main dining room. They saw my work at a gallery showing and commissioned something specifically for their space." "How much are they paying you?" The question had cut straight to what she considered the only relevant detail. $800, I'd said proudly. It was more money than I'd ever made from a single piece, enough to cover my studio rent for 2 months. The silence that followed spoke volumes. $800 was what my mother spent on a weekend shopping trip, what my father paid for a single dinner with clients. To them, it wasn't a meaningful sum, it was confirmation that my career was a joke. "Well," she'd finally said, "I suppose every little bit helps." Every little bit. As if my first real commission was pocket change, a hobby sale rather than a professional milestone. Standing in the Morrison Contemporary 7 years later, watching my mother admire work that had sold for nearly 100 times that first commission, I felt the weight of all those dismissive comments, all those years of being treated like a child playing dress-up rather than an adult building a career. The difference wasn't just in the dollar amounts, though those mattered too, representing the market's validation of my artistic vision. The difference was in the respect. My mother was listening to James Morrison's explanations with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about technique and artistic intent. She was engaging with my work the way she'd engage with any other serious art, giving it the consideration she'd never been willing to offer when she knew it was mine. I wondered what she would have said if, 7 years ago, I'd been able to show her a glimpse of this moment. Would she have been more supportive if she'd known I would eventually achieve the kind of success she could recognize and value? Or would she have dismissed it as impossible, too unlikely to factor into her assessment of my choices? The question was hypothetical now, but it illuminated something important about how my family valued achievement. They couldn't support potential, they could only celebrate actualized success, and only success that fit their narrow definition of what mattered. Innovation, risk-taking, the long, slow work of mastering a craft, none of that registered as worthwhile unless, and until it produced results they could quantify and compare to their own accomplishments. Watching my father study the technical specifications placard next to Metamorphosis, I remembered his reaction when I'd tried to explain the complexities of working with molten glass. I'd been so excited to share what I was learning, to help him understand that this wasn't just art in some vague, decorative sense, but a discipline that required the same kind of precision and problem-solving skills he valued in engineering. "You heat glass to over 2,000 degrees, I'd explained enthusiastically during one of our strained phone conversations, and then you have maybe 20 minutes to shape it before it cools too much to work with. You have to plan every move, account for how different materials will respond to heat and cooling, calculate stress points and structural integrity. It's like engineering, but with beauty as the end goal instead of utility." "That's nice, sweetheart," he'd replied in the tone people use when children show them crayon drawings. Nice. As if I'd described a cute hobby rather than a technically demanding craft that required years to master. Now I watched him read about my innovative fusion techniques and mastery of thermal dynamics in mixed media sculpture with the same careful attention he brought to technical journals in his own field. The work was the same, I was using the exact techniques I'd tried to describe to him years ago. But the context had changed everything. Presented in a prestigious gallery with institutional validation and serious price tags, my technical achievements suddenly became worthy of his engineering brain's consideration. Miguel approached a smaller piece called Urban Migration, a sculpture that incorporated glass elements with reclaimed steel from demolished Boston buildings. I'd made it during my 3rd year in the city, when I was struggling to understand my place in an urban environment that felt simultaneously inspiring and alienating. "This one feels different," he observed, leaning closer to examine the interplay between the organic glass forms and the geometric steel framework. "More grounded somehow." I remembered the day I'd finished that piece, how I'd stood in my studio at 3 in the morning, exhausted and covered in glass dust, but feeling like I'd finally captured something true about the experience of building a life in a city that wasn't built for you. The glass represented adaptation, flexibility, transparency, the way you had to remain open to possibility even when surrounded by structures that seemed immutable. The steel was history, foundation, the weight of all the dreams and disappointments that had been built and demolished on the same ground where I was trying to create something new. Miguel had always been the most empathetic member of our family, the one most likely to ask how I was feeling rather than what I was accomplishing. But even he had struggled to understand why I chose uncertainty over security, creative expression over financial stability. He'd never criticized my choices directly, but I'd seen the worry in his eyes, the way he'd slip me money at family gatherings with the unspoken assumption that I must be struggling, must need help. Urban migration was my attempt to explain that struggle wasn't the same as failure, that choosing difficulty didn't mean choosing unwisely. Some things worth having could only be built through uncertainty, risk, the willingness to fail spectacularly in pursuit of something that mattered more than safety. James Morrison himself approached their group, and I watched my parents straighten with the automatic deference they showed to anyone with obvious cultural authority. "Are you folks enjoying the exhibition?" he asked warmly. "Very much," my mother replied. "We're particularly intrigued by this SM piece. Can you tell us anything about the artist?" James smiled mysteriously. "SM is one of the most exciting talents I've worked with in 20 years. Completely self-directed, uncompromising vision, technical mastery that rivals artists with twice the experience. This is actually SM's first major solo show, though the work has been quietly building a following among serious collectors for years." "First solo show?" My father looked skeptical. "The technique seems quite advanced for someone just starting out." "Oh, SM isn't just starting out," James chuckled. "The artist has been developing this signature style for nearly a decade. It's just that SM prefers to let the work speak rather than courting publicity. Very refreshing in today's art world, where so many artists are more focused on their personal brand than their craft." I could see my parents exchanging glances, recalibrating their assumptions. In their world, legitimate artists were supposed to be famous, recognizable, frequently featured in magazines. The idea that someone could build a serious career while remaining relatively anonymous seemed to confuse them. Elena was studying metamorphosis more closely now, her business school training evident in the way she analyzed the technical aspects. "The precision of the glasswork is remarkable," she said. "And the way it interacts with the lighting, it almost seems alive." "That's exactly what SM is known for," James replied enthusiastically. "The ability to make static materials seem organic, fluid. There's something almost alchemical about the process." I decided it was time to make my entrance. I approached the group from behind, my work boots clicking softly on the polished concrete floor. "Excuse me," I said quietly. They turned, and I watched the sequence of emotions play across their faces: surprise, confusion, embarrassment, and finally, reluctant recognition. "Sarah?" my mother whispered, as if she couldn't quite believe I was there. "Hi, Mom." I looked around the group, meeting each of their eyes. "Dad." "Elena." "Miguel." "What are you doing here?" Elena asked, not unkindly but clearly confused about how her struggling artist sister had ended up at such an exclusive event. "I was invited," I replied simply. James Morrison appeared at my elbow, and I could see the moment my family realized he knew exactly who I was. "Sarah?" "Perfect timing. I was just telling this lovely family about your work. They were particularly impressed with metamorphosis." The silence stretched out like taffy. I watched my father's face as the implications hit him, followed by my mother's sharp intake of breath as she connected the dots. "SM," my mother said faintly. "Sarah Martinez." "That's right." I turned to James. "This is my family, the ones I was telling you about." James beamed, clearly delighted by the coincidence. "How wonderful. You must be so proud. Sarah is one of the most promising artists of her generation. The Smithsonian acquisition, the upcoming Milan exhibition, it's all quite remarkable." I watched my parents try to process this information. 7 years of assumptions crumbling in real time. "The Smithsonian?" Elena repeated weakly. "Acquired one of Sarah's pieces for their permanent collection last month," James confirmed. "Quite an honor for an artist of any age, but particularly impressive for someone who's only 32. My father looked like he was trying to solve a complex equation. "But you live in that warehouse space. You wear—" He gestured helplessly at my outfit, the black dress I'd paired with my paint-stained work boots because they were comfortable and because, honestly, I was still the same person who valued function over form. "I live in that warehouse space because it's my studio," I explained patiently. "The living area is upstairs. It's actually quite nice, I renovated it myself. And yes, I wear work clothes when I'm working. Tonight seemed like a good occasion to dress up. Miguel found his voice first. Sarah, this is… Jesus. I mean, congratulations. This is incredible. Thank you, I replied, and I meant it. Miguel had always been the most genuinely supportive, even when he clearly didn't understand my choices. Elena was staring at the price tag next to Metamorphosis. $65,000? For one piece. That's actually on the lower end for Sarah's current work, James interjected proudly. The larger installations can go for considerably more. There's quite a waiting list. I watched my mother's face cycle through a dozen emotions: pride, confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been hurt. Why didn't you tell us? She asked quietly. Tell you what? I replied. That I was doing exactly what I said I would do 7 years ago. That I was building a career as a professional artist? I tried to tell you, Mom. You just didn't want to hear it. We thought. My father started, then stopped. We were worried you were struggling. I was struggling, I acknowledged. For the first few years, it was exactly as hard as you predicted. But struggling and failing aren't the same thing. I kept working, kept improving, kept believing in what I was doing even when you couldn't. James, sensing the emotional weight of the conversation, excused himself diplomatically. I'll let you folks catch up. Sarah, don't forget, the Times critic wants to speak with you before the evening ends. After he left, we stood in awkward silence for a moment, surrounded by my work and the soft murmur of gallery conversations. The New York Times? Elena asked eventually. Wants to do a feature on emerging artists who've managed to build serious careers without traditional gallery representation, I explained. Apparently, my story is interesting to them. Your story, my mother repeated. The story where your family didn't support you? I considered lying, offering comfort instead of truth. But we'd gotten this far on honesty. The story where I believed in myself even when the people closest to me didn't, I said gently. Where I proved that passion and persistence could overcome skepticism and doubt. It's not a story about bad parents, Mom. It's a story about a woman who chose her own path. Elena was still studying my work, her analytical mind clearly working through the implications. Sarah, the technical skill required for this, how long did it take you to develop this technique? Years, I replied. Remember that thesis piece you all thought was a waste of time? That was the beginning. Every failure, every experiment, every piece that didn't work, they all led to this. I gestured around the gallery at the sculptures that represented thousands of hours of work, countless burns from the glass furnace, nights when I fell asleep in my studio chair because I was too exhausted to climb the stairs to my apartment. I wish we had understood, my mother said, and for the first time in years, her voice carried genuine regret. You couldn't have, I replied. You saw an 18-year-old throwing away a Harvard scholarship for what looked like a whim. From your perspective, you were trying to protect me from making a huge mistake. But we were wrong, my father said quietly. You weren't wrong to worry, I corrected. You were wrong to assume that your definition of success was the only valid one. And you were wrong to stop believing in me when the path got difficult. Miguel, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. Sarah, I need to ask, are you happy? Really happy, not just professionally successful. The question caught me off guard, partly because it was so perceptive and partly because it was the first time in years that anyone in my family had asked about my emotional well-being rather than my career prospects. Yes, I said without hesitation. I wake up every morning excited to work. I spend my days creating things that didn't exist before, solving problems that challenge me, collaborating with other artists who inspire me. I have enough money to live comfortably, enough recognition to work with amazing venues and collectors, and enough creative freedom to keep pushing boundaries. I'm exactly where I want to be. And personally? Elena pressed. Relationships, social life? I smiled. I'm not married with 2.5 kids and a house in the suburbs, if that's what you're asking. But I have a partner who understands my work, friends who challenge and support me, a community of artists who feel like family. My life looks different from yours, but it's mine. The conversation was interrupted by a young woman with a camera and press badge who approached our group. Excuse me, are you SM? I'm Rebecca Chen from the Globe's art section. Could I get a photo and perhaps a quick quote about tonight's opening? I glanced at my family, then nodded. Of course. As Rebecca positioned me in front of one of my sculptures and began taking photos, I could see my parents watching with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. This was their daughter, the one they'd written off as impractical and naive, being photographed for a newspaper article about her successful art exhibition. Can you tell me about your artistic journey? Rebecca asked. Your bio mentions you're Boston-based, but you've maintained quite a low profile until now. I've been focused on developing my craft rather than building a public persona, I replied. For me, the work has always been the most important thing. Recognition is wonderful, but it's not why I became an artist. What would you say to young artists who are struggling to balance creative passion with practical concerns? I thought about 18-year-old me, standing in my parents' living room trying to explain why I was choosing art school over law school. I'd say that practical concerns are real and shouldn't be dismissed, I replied. But neither should your creative vision. Success rarely happens overnight, and it almost never looks the way you expect it to. The question isn't whether you'll face challenges, it's whether you're willing to keep working through them because you believe in what you're creating. After Rebecca finished her interview and moved on to photograph other works, my family approached me again. That was well said, my mother offered quietly. Thank you. Elena was looking around the gallery with new eyes. Sarah, can you walk us through some of your other pieces? I'd like to understand your process better. For the next hour, I guided them through the exhibition, explaining techniques and inspirations, sharing stories about particular pieces. I watched my father's engineer brain engage with the technical challenges of working with molten glass. I saw my mother begin to understand the aesthetic choices that had once seemed random to her. Elena asked insightful questions about business sustainability and market positioning that showed she was taking my career seriously as a professional endeavor, not just a hobby that had accidentally become profitable. Miguel, characteristically, focused on the human elements. This piece here, Urban Solitude, there's something melancholy about it. I made that during my second year in Boston, I explained. I was feeling pretty isolated, missing family connections, but also not sure how to bridge the gap that had formed. Working through those emotions in the glass helped me understand them better. Were you lonely? My mother asked, and I could hear the guilt in her voice. Sometimes, I admitted. But loneliness and solitude are different things. I chose solitude as a way to focus on my work. The loneliness was harder. That was about feeling like the people I loved didn't understand or support the most important part of who I am. The evening began winding down around us. Collectors had made their final decisions, critics had finished their interviews, and the gallery staff was beginning the subtle process of encouraging guests to migrate toward the exit. Sarah, my father said as we prepared to leave, would you like to come to dinner this weekend? At the house. I considered the offer. The old house in Beacon Hill, with its formal dining room and uncomfortable chairs and atmosphere of barely concealed judgment. How about you all come to my studio instead? I suggested. I'll cook, I've gotten pretty good at it over the years. You can see where I actually work, meet some of my friends, get a better sense of my real life. Elena looked uncertain. Are you sure? We don't want to impose. It's not imposing if I'm inviting you, I replied. But I need to be clear about something. I'm not the same person who left your house 7 years ago feeling like a failure. I won't apologize for my choices or defend my lifestyle or pretend to be someone I'm not in order to make you comfortable. We wouldn't expect you to, my mother said, though I wondered if she really understood what that meant. Good. Then Sunday at 2. Wear clothes you don't mind getting a little dusty, I'll give you the full studio tour. As we prepared to part ways on the sidewalk outside the gallery, Miguel surprised me with a fierce hug. I'm proud of you, he said quietly. Not just for tonight, but for sticking with it. For proving us all wrong. You weren't wrong to worry, I replied. You were wrong to give up on me. Elena was more reserved, but when she hugged me goodbye, she whispered, I have a lot to apologize for. And a lot to learn about who you really are. My parents stood together, looking older and smaller than I remembered, still processing the evening's revelations. Sarah, my mother said hesitantly, I know we can't undo the last 7 years, but I hope we can build something better going forward. I hope so too, I replied and meant it. My father stepped forward and, for the first time since I was a child, pulled me into a genuine embrace. I'm sorry, he said simply. I'm sorry we couldn't see what was right in front of us. After they left, I walked back into the gallery for one final look around. James was overseeing the installation of sold tags next to several pieces, and he grinned when he saw me return. How did it go with the family reunion? Better than I expected, I replied honestly. More complicated than I hoped. Families usually are, he observed philosophically. But they seemed genuinely impressed tonight. Your mother spent 10 minutes studying reflection series after you stepped away to talk to Rebecca. I felt a small warmth at that information. Reflection series was one of my most personal works, a meditation on identity and self-perception rendered in layers of translucent glass. James, I said, thank you. Not just for tonight, but for believing in my work before anyone else did. For giving me the space to develop without pressure, for understanding that I needed to do this my own way. Sarah, you've never needed me to believe in your work, he replied. You've always had that covered. All I did was provide a platform for other people to discover what I already knew, that you're extraordinary. I left the gallery that night feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because my family had finally recognized my success, but because I had finally stopped needing their recognition to validate my choices. The drive back to Somerville took me through the heart of Boston, past the neighborhoods where I'd struggled and grown and eventually thrived. The city looked different tonight, not because anything had changed, but because I was seeing it through new eyes. The eyes of someone who no longer felt like she was proving herself, but simply living her truth. Sunday afternoon arrived with surprising swiftness. I spent the morning cleaning my studio and apartment, not to impress my family, but because I wanted them to see the space at its best, organized, functional, filled with natural light and half-finished projects and the comfortable chaos of a working artist's environment. They arrived promptly at 2, all 4 of them looking slightly uncertain in their weekend casual clothes. Elena had clearly struggled with the concept of clothes you don't mind getting dusty, and settled on a crisp white button-down and dark jeans that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Welcome to my world, I said, leading them up the industrial staircase to my living space. The apartment I'd created in the upper level of the warehouse was a reflection of everything my parents' house wasn't: open, colorful, filled with handmade furniture and plants and artwork by friends. The kitchen was small but efficient, the living room centered around comfort rather than formal entertaining, the bedroom tucked into a cozy alcove with skylights that turned morning coffee into a daily celebration. This is beautiful, my mother said, and she sounded genuinely surprised. It's very you, Elena added, which I took as a compliment. After lunch, I led them downstairs to the studio proper. The space was cathedral-like, with soaring ceilings and enormous windows that flooded the area with natural light. My glass furnace dominated one corner, surrounded by the tools and materials of my trade. Works in progress sat on pedestals throughout the space, each one representing hours of planning and experimentation. This is where the magic happens, I said, pulling on heat-resistant gloves and firing up the furnace. Who wants to see how glass sculpture actually gets made? For the next 2 hours, I demonstrated the techniques I'd spent years perfecting. I showed them how to heat glass to the precise temperature where it becomes workable but not uncontrollable, how to shape it with breath and gravity and carefully applied pressure, how to combine it with metal elements to create the layered complexity that had become my signature. My father, the engineer, was fascinated by the technical aspects. He asked detailed questions about temperature control and material compatibility, taking notes in a small notebook he'd produced from his pocket. Elena approached the process like a business case study, wanting to understand production timelines and quality control and scalability issues. Miguel was drawn to the creative problem-solving aspect, the way each piece required improvisation and adaptation as the materials responded to heat and handling. My mother stood quietly watching for most of the demonstration, but I could see her artist's eye at work, studying the way light moved through the glass, the relationship between form and function, the careful balance of planning and spontaneity that every piece required. "It's much more complex than I imagined," she admitted when I finally shut down the furnace. "Most people think art is either completely spontaneous or completely controlled," I replied. "The truth is somewhere in between. You need technical mastery to execute your vision, but you also need to be open to happy accidents and unexpected discoveries." As evening approached, we migrated back to my living room with wine and the dessert Elena had insisted on bringing. The conversation flowed more easily now, lubricated by shared experience and genuine curiosity rather than years of accumulated misunderstanding. "Sarah," my mother said during a quiet moment, "I owe you an apology. Not just for not supporting your career choice, but for not trusting your judgment. You were 18 and passionate and determined, and instead of celebrating those qualities, I tried to talk you out of them." "You were scared," I replied. "I understand that now in a way I couldn't then. You saw the statistics about artists who struggle financially, and you wanted to protect me from that struggle. But in trying to protect you from potential failure, we failed you ourselves," my father added. "We should have found ways to support your dreams while also helping you develop practical skills." Elena leaned forward. "What would that have looked like? If we could go back and handle it differently?" I considered the question seriously. Maybe asking to understand my goals instead of dismissing them. Maybe helping me create a realistic business plan instead of assuming I didn't have one. Maybe trusting that I was smart enough to make informed decisions about my own life. "Did you have a business plan at 18? Miguel asked with a grin. "Not a formal one," I admitted. "But I had researched earning potential, identified successful artists whose careers I wanted to emulate, and developed benchmarks for measuring progress. I wasn't just throwing myself into the unknown, I was taking a calculated risk based on my assessment of my own abilities and the market opportunities." "That's more strategic thinking than I gave you credit for," Elena said ruefully. "Because you never asked," I replied, not accusingly but matter-of-factly. "You made assumptions about my level of preparation and commitment based on your preconceptions about artists in general." We talked until well past sunset, covering 7 years of missed conversations and misunderstood motivations. I learned that Miguel had often defended my choices in family discussions, that Elena had secretly kept track of my career through mutual friends, that my parents had driven past my studio building multiple times over the years, but never worked up the courage to stop. "What stopped you?" I asked. "Pride," my father admitted. "And fear that you wouldn't want to see us." "And guilt," my mother added. The longer we waited, the harder it became to imagine bridging the gap we'd created. As they prepared to leave, Elena surprised me with a request. "Sarah, I have a client who's renovating their corporate headquarters. They're looking for significant art installations, the kind of pieces that make a statement about company culture and values. Would you be interested in submitting a proposal? Is this your way of trying to help me financially?" I asked with amusement. "No," she replied seriously. "This is my way of recognizing that you're a professional artist whose work would be perfect for this project. The fact that you're my sister is irrelevant to the quality of your art, but it's very relevant to how proud I am to recommend you." I accepted her business card and promised to follow up. Not because I needed the work, but because it felt like a genuine gesture of respect for my professional capabilities. After they left, I sat in my living room surrounded by the comfortable chaos of my chosen life and reflected on the evening's conversations. 7 years ago, I had left my family's house feeling like a failure, convinced that I would have to choose between their love and my dreams. Tonight, I understood that the choice had never been mine to make. Love that requires you to sacrifice your authentic self isn't really love at all. It's control disguised as caring. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena. Thank you for today. For showing us who you really are and for giving us another chance to appreciate it. Then Miguel, your studio is incredible. I finally understand why you chose this path. Then my mother, I'm going to learn everything I can about contemporary glass sculpture. I want to understand your world. Finally, my father, I was wrong about dirt and disguise. What you do is alchemy, turning raw materials into beauty. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. I smiled and set my phone aside. Tomorrow I would respond to their messages, continue building these fragile new bridges between us. But tonight I simply sat in my perfectly imperfect space, surrounded by the evidence of choices made and dreams pursued, feeling complete in a way that had nothing to do with their approval and everything to do with my own hard-won self-acceptance. The girl who had left their house 7 years ago had been seeking permission to become herself. The woman who welcomed them into her studio today had long since granted herself that permission and built a life worthy of it. Outside my windows, the city sparkled with possibility, and inside my heart, for the first time in years, there was space for both my family and my dreams to coexist. The reconciliation wasn't complete. Relationships damaged by years of misunderstanding don't heal overnight. But it was a beginning, and sometimes a beginning is the most beautiful creation of all. Over the following weeks, our tentative reconnection deepened in ways I hadn't expected. Elena followed through on her corporate commission lead, but more importantly, she started stopping by my studio unannounced, something she'd never done in all the years I'd been working as an artist. She'd arrive with coffee and pastries, claiming she was in the neighborhood, though we both knew Somerville wasn't exactly on her usual route between Wellesley and downtown Boston. During one of these visits, I was working on a particularly challenging piece, a large-scale installation that would eventually hang in the lobby of a new residential building in Cambridge. The sculpture incorporated nearly 300 individual glass elements, each one hand-blown and carefully calibrated to catch and refract light at specific angles throughout the day. How do you keep track of all the pieces? Elena asked, watching me carefully arrange glass components on a work table according to a complex diagram I'd drawn. Each one is numbered and catalogued, I explained, showing her my detailed planning notebook. I have to account for seasonal changes in light, the way the sun moves across the space at different times of year, how the colors will interact when viewed from various angles in the lobby. She picked up the notebook, studying my meticulous calculations and sketches with the same intensity she brought to analyzing financial projections. Sarah, this is incredibly sophisticated. The level of planning, the attention to detail, it's like project management meets engineering meets art. That's exactly what it is, I replied, grateful that she was finally seeing the complexity behind what she'd once dismissed as creative whimsy. People think artists just follow inspiration, but major installations like this require months of planning, precise execution, collaboration with architects and contractors. It's creative work, but it's also professional work in every sense. Elena was quiet for a moment, still studying my diagrams. I owe you an apology that goes deeper than what I said the other night. I didn't just misunderstand your career choice, I fundamentally underestimated your intelligence and professionalism. I assumed that because you were choosing something unconventional, you must not have thought it through properly. Why? I asked, genuinely curious about her thought process. Because, she said slowly, in my world, smart people follow established paths. They get good grades, attend prestigious schools, join reputable companies, climb predictable ladders. The idea that someone could be equally intelligent and strategic while creating their own path. I couldn't compute it. I set down my tools and gave her my full attention. This was the most honest conversation we'd had about our fundamental differences in worldview. Your path worked for you, I said. Harvard Business School, marriage to David, the house in Wellesley, your position at the consulting firm. You built the life you wanted using the tools and opportunities that made sense for your goals and personality. But I couldn't imagine that other approaches might be equally valid, she continued. I thought there was one right way to be successful, and if you weren't following it, you must be making a mistake. And now? She gestured around my studio, taking in the organized chaos of work in progress, the sophisticated equipment, the evidence of a thriving professional practice. Now I see that success has many different architectures. What you've built here is just as substantial as what I've built in the corporate world, it's just constructed differently. Miguel's relationship with my work evolved in a different direction. He started bringing his teenage daughter, my niece Carmen, to visit the studio. Carmen was 15 and struggling with her own version of family expectations, expected to follow in her father's legal footsteps, but increasingly drawn to environmental science and activism. "Aunt Sarah," she said during one visit, "how did you know you were making the right choice when everyone was telling you it was wrong?" I paused in my work, recognizing the weight behind her question. Carmen was facing her own version of the pressure that had nearly derailed my confidence years earlier. "I didn't know it was the right choice," I answered honestly. "I knew it was my choice. There's a difference. But what if you had failed? What if your art had never sold, if you'd ended up broke and struggling?" "Then I would have been broke and struggling while doing something I believed in," I replied. Which seemed better than being successful doing something that felt meaningless to me. Carmen considered this seriously. "My friends think I'm crazy for wanting to study environmental science instead of going pre-law. They say there's no money in it, no clear career path." "Your friends might be right about the money," I said. "But they're wrong about the career path. There are lots of paths, some of them just haven't been mapped yet." Miguel, listening to this conversation, later told me it was the first time Carmen had opened up about her career anxieties with any adult in the family. "She's been carrying this stress for months, afraid to disappoint us, afraid to follow her instincts. Seeing what you've built gave her permission to consider other possibilities." My parents' reconnection with my work took the most dramatic form. My mother, true to her word, began educating herself about contemporary glass sculpture. She subscribed to art magazines, attended lectures at the Museum of Fine Arts, even enrolled in a weekend workshop on glass appreciation at a local community college. "I want to understand your medium the way I understand oil painting or watercolor," she explained during one of our weekly phone calls, another new development in our relationship. "I realized I've been trying to appreciate your work using criteria that don't apply to sculpture." Her dedication to learning was both touching and slightly overwhelming. She'd call with questions about technical processes, send me articles about other glass artists she'd discovered, offer observations about how my work compared to historical precedents she'd researched. "Mom," I said gently during one particularly intense conversation about the philosophical implications of transparency in sculptural work, "you don't need to become an expert to support me. Just being interested is enough. But I want to be able to talk to you about your work the way I talk to Elena about business or Miguel about legal cases," she replied. "I want to ask intelligent questions, offer meaningful feedback. I've missed 7 years of your artistic development. I have catching up to do." My father's approach was characteristically methodical. He visited my studio with a notebook and asked to understand every aspect of my business operation. How did I price pieces? What were my material costs? How did I manage inventory? What was my production capacity? At first, I worried he was looking for flaws in my business model, problems he could point out as evidence that I still needed guidance. But as the conversation continued, I realized he was genuinely trying to understand how I'd built something sustainable in a field he'd previously dismissed as economically non-viable. "Your profit margins are actually quite impressive," he said, studying the financial overview I'd prepared for him. "And the growth trajectory over the past 5 years shows excellent market positioning." "Dad," I said with amusement, "you sound surprised." "I am surprised," he admitted. "Not that you're talented, I always knew that. But I underestimated how business savvy you are. This isn't just an art practice, it's a well-run enterprise." "They're not mutually exclusive," I pointed out. "Artists who want to make a living from their work have to be good at business too. We have to understand markets, manage cash flow, negotiate contracts, build client relationships. The romantic image of the artist who's above such practical concerns is mostly mythology." He nodded thoughtfully. I made the mistake of thinking that because you prioritize creative fulfillment, you must be naive about economic realities. I should have known better. You've always been practical and strategic, even as a child. You were scared, I said, offering him the same understanding I'd given my mother. You saw an 18-year-old choosing uncertainty over security, and your protective instincts kicked in. My controlling instincts, he corrected. I thought I knew better than you what would make you happy and successful. That was arrogant. These individual conversations with family members helped me understand how much our estrangement had cost all of us. They'd missed not just my professional development, but my personal growth as well. I'd learned to cook elaborate meals for dinner parties with artist friends. I'd traveled to residencies in Italy and Japan, expanding both my artistic skills and my cultural perspective. I'd navigated romantic relationships, including my current partnership with David, a photographer whose work complemented mine in interesting ways. They knew none of these details of my life. In their minds, I was still essentially the 18-year-old who'd left home with big dreams and limited practical experience. They couldn't understand my current confidence and competence because they'd missed watching me develop both through years of incremental growth and occasional spectacular failures. During a family dinner at my studio, now a monthly tradition, Elena asked about my relationship with David. "How long have you been together?" she asked, having just met him for the first time. 3 years, I replied, watching their faces register surprise. 3 years. My mother looked genuinely hurt. Why didn't we know about him? Because we weren't talking, I said simply. And when we started talking again, it was about rebuilding our relationship, not catching up on my dating history. David, to his credit, navigated the awkwardness with grace. He understood that this family reconciliation was fragile and important, and he didn't take their ignorance of his existence personally. Sarah mentioned that you're a photographer, Miguel said, clearly trying to bridge the gap with professional interest. I am, David replied. I actually document a lot of artists' work for gallery submissions and catalog photography. That's how Sarah and I met. I was hired to photograph her pieces for a museum acquisition. So you understand her work professionally, my father observed. I understand that her work is extraordinary, David said simply. But more than that, I understand why she does it. The way she talks about glass, about light, about creating something that transforms space, it's clear this isn't just a career for her. It's a calling. After David left that evening, my family seemed different somehow. More relaxed, more accepting. It was as if meeting him had helped them understand that I wasn't living a lonely, struggling artist's life, but a full, rich, connected life that simply looked different from theirs. He seems wonderful, my mother said as we cleaned up from dinner. He is, I replied. But what would you have said if he seemed terrible? Or if I was single? Or if I was in a relationship with a woman? She paused, considering the question seriously. A year ago, I probably would have worried that you were making poor choices in relationships too. Now I trust your judgment. If you love someone, I assume you have good reasons. That trust, hard-won and carefully rebuilt, felt more valuable than their earlier approval would have. It was based on knowing who I actually was rather than who they'd wanted me to become. As autumn progressed into winter, our family gatherings became more natural, less fraught with the need to prove anything or overcome past hurts. We developed new traditions that honored both our reconnection and our individual growth. My parents started hosting art salons at their Beacon Hill house, inviting friends to view and discuss work by local artists, with my pieces prominently featured alongside others they'd collected. Elena began commissioning art for her corporate clients, not just from me but from other artists she discovered through her newfound interest in Boston's creative community. Miguel started bringing Carmen to gallery openings and artist talks, nurturing her growing confidence in choosing unconventional paths. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the simplest one. They stopped treating my career as something that needed to be fixed or improved. They asked about my work the way they'd ask about any family member's professional life, with genuine interest in current projects, pride in recent successes, and support during challenging periods. The family reconciliation wasn't complete. Relationships damaged by years of misunderstanding don't heal overnight. But it was real, built on mutual respect rather than conditional approval. And for the first time since leaving home, I felt like I belonged somewhere that honored both where I'd come from and who I'd chosen to become. Standing in my studio on a December evening, watching snow fall past the enormous windows while my latest sculpture caught and refracted the warm light from my work lamps, I realized that success had never been about proving my family wrong. It had been about proving to myself that I was right about my vision, my values, my willingness to build something beautiful from raw materials and unwavering determination. The girl who had left their house 7 years ago seeking permission to become herself had instead learned to grant herself that permission. And in doing so, she'd created space for her family to love not just the person they'd wanted her to be, but the person she'd courageously become.